Welcome, my name is Terence Maloon. This is lecture number 7 in the series The 50 Years That Changed Painting. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly for sponsoring this series and its transfer online, and the Drill Hall Gallery and its director Tony Oates for having invited me to do these lectures. All our cultural values are the deposit of a succession of past upheavals, but it is for us to say what these upheavals signify. That's a quote from Michael Polanyi, one of the 20th century's greatest polymaths. We'll be meeting up with him again in lecture number 11 in this series. Both Michael Polanyi and his brother Carl were brilliant diagnosticians of upheavals. Michael charted the phenomena of modernity across a broad front of the arts and sciences, whereas Carl was the earliest and most incisive critic of the economic theory of neoliberalism. It's a shame, really, that the objections and warnings of his 1944 book weren't taken more seriously. We might have escaped the situation in which we find ourselves at present, but that's not what we're here to discuss. As you are by now well aware from previous lectures in the series, the 50 years between 1867 and 1917, the 50 years that changed painting, appear in hindsight as a series of great upheavals, tremendously dramatic and transformational. However, we need to remind ourselves once again that virtually everywhere in the Western world, virtually everywhere in the Eurosphere at the dawn of the 20th century, this is what modern art still looked like. There had been upheavals in the past, to be sure, but these affected tiny minorities, artists on the fringes, highly localized little coteries, and they seem to have had little serious impact overall, whereas there were hundreds and thousands of professionally trained painters and sculptors who crowded the centers, always in the foreground, always hogging the limelight, receiving honors and fame, commissions and sales, which seemed to be theirs and theirs alone. This is an installation of paintings, the likes of which you could encounter just about anywhere at the turn of the century, in London, Paris, Munich, Melbourne, Cleveland, Ohio. It's actually the founding collection of the Museum of Modern Art in Rome. And if you wanted to pay top dollar for a contemporary painting, Bouguereau was still at the height of his fame. These paintings were done in 1901 and 1902. We've encountered Bouguereau in some previous lectures, of course. He and Cézanne died within a year of one another, and would have represented polar opposites in the world of contemporary art. At more or less the same time that Bouguereau was painting these works, Cézanne was preoccupied with a series of large-scale figure compositions, the grandes baigneuses, the great bathers, pictures which, in my understanding, are the outcome of a succession of upheavals that struck at the very roots of the representational conventions that had held sway in European art up until then. As I see it, Cézanne was an artist who stood directly on a fault line running through French painting in the 19th century. He inherited and epitomized all of its aberrations and dysfunctions, which came to a head in his example. I know how terrible that sounds, yet finally it was a terrible fate, a terrible burden to carry. And the idea of Cézanne as a saint and martyr, or as a convict laborer of painting, as someone put it, isn't lacking in evidence or in justification. To propose a comprehensive explanation of how and why a painting like this came to be wouldn't be possible, but we can show in its historical background and contemporary context certain conventions breaking down. We can acknowledge as well an altered understanding of reality, of nature, of truth, of subjectivity coming into play. We can trace the negative dialectic of the modern era, shaking up and throwing into question many of the old verities. We can also situate a work like this in its divergence from the prevailing professional orthodoxies and in reaction to the faltering authority of state ideological institutions like the Salon and the Academy in France. Cézanne was the most egregiously unacademic, the most resolutely anti-academic painter imaginable. Already at the time of the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, Cézanne had come to exemplify an incorrigibly eccentric and inept aspiring painter who made a dramatic appearance at the Salon year after year. The journalist Jean Prouvaire, writing for the newspaper Le Rappel, tells us as much. Quote, "Shall we speak of Mr. Cézanne, who, moreover, has his legend? Of all known juries, none has ever, even in a dream, seen the possibility of accepting any picture by this painter, who presented himself at the Salon carrying his canvases on his back like Jesus Christ his cross." That was published in 1874, and 6 years earlier, Cézanne was very publicly held up for ridicule for his Salon submissions. An angular, ugly, reclining nude, presumably lost, probably destroyed, and this portrait of a fellow painter from Aix-en-Provence, Achille Empereur, now a very famous painting in the Musée d'Orsay's collection. The cartoonist Stock, well named because he makes a laughing stock of both Cézanne and Empereur, is probably unaware that Empereur was a hunchback and a dwarf, and that the proportions rendered in this painting are actually quite true to life, not bungled by the painter. However, it's mostly for the bony, disjointed travesty of a female nude that Cézanne is being arraigned. For bad drawing, mangled anatomy, lack of idealization. They don't belong, they can't be admitted into the public domain, into an officially sanctioned showcase of contemporary art. On the left is a caricature by Daumier. It has nothing to do with Cézanne, but you may well be struck by the dashed-off, cursory way Daumier has drawn those nudes. Daumier was one of the great draftsmen of the 19th century, and his specialty was caricature. Cézanne, like many of his contemporaries, greatly admired Daumier and would have looked long and hard at his work. That kind of devil-may-care, perfunctory fluency, the overall sense of nervy, swift, spontaneous improvisation. Those qualities would have greatly appealed to Cézanne. Daumier didn't work from models in making his caricatures, and the majority of Cézanne's figure paintings are also done without models. The strength of Daumier's caricatures relies on his memory and imagination. When he restages a particular situation or creates a fictitious event, it's always believable, and usually vividly so. Seizing the essence of a facial expression, portraying body language, Daumier can do this brilliantly, and Cézanne not, or barely at all. At the end of his days, as we see in his studio in 1904, he's sitting in front of one of the monumental Bathers compositions. And as we see both here and in his earliest efforts, there seems to be no facility whatsoever for making figures of his imagination individual, believable, and lifelike. There's no talent for developing an anecdote and making human interactions interesting or even comprehensible. The earliest extant sketchbook of Cézanne's is in the Louvre, and there are some detached drawings in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, drawings that Cézanne did between the ages of 18 and 20. And that's one of them on the screen. Without exception, these drawings are wretchedly bad, and quite appalling that they come from a grown man. You might well conclude that they were made by a person with no aptitude whatsoever to be a visual artist, let alone with the potential to become a great one, to become Cézanne. The impressions we get from those early works of their incompetency and limitation, of something defective, perhaps of something abnormal, of some cognitive deficiency, these are precisely reflected again and again in the judgments, damning judgments, delivered by Cézanne's contemporaries, not least of whom was his erstwhile best friend, Émile Zola. However, Cézanne was unswayed. He persisted and persisted and persisted, and it is extraordinary how those bad early drawings developed, how they functioned as a sort of fallback or default position for Cézanne. There's a famous sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who made some incursions into art history and aesthetics that I found very insightful and helpful. Pierre Bourdieu would call the fallback position we've just identified, he'd call it a habitus. A habitus. I like that word for its implication of a habitat, a haven, a comfort zone, a home base, and also because it contains the word habit. Cézanne never abandoned his early habits, which were part, it would seem, of an imaginative or imaginary habitat. He acquired the habit of filling sketchbooks with clunky figures drawn from imagination. These habits would reclaim him and keep him amused unfailingly, it would seem. Of course, there's something profoundly compulsive and regressive about it, and yet the modern artists who were to follow Cézanne, Picasso, Klee, Dubuffet, de Kooning, wasn't their art also motivated by something powerfully regressive, by a powerfully regressive impulse? So don't be lulled into supposing that Cézanne made bad drawings because he couldn't do better and didn't recognize any difference between good and bad. Don't be lulled into thinking that the normal, average academic competencies shared by hundreds and thousands of professionally trained artists were beyond his capacity. That's simply not true. This is a decent, unexceptional, boring academic life painting. Number 8 in the Cézanne Catalogue Raisonné from circa 1858. No doubt, once upon a time, there were more works of this kind, more or less correct, more or less diligent, of no distinctive quality. There are Cézanne's drawings related to the portrait he painted of Achille Empereur from around 1869 to 70, and how amazing are they? They could hold their own beside the greatest old master portrait drawings, whether by Rubens or Van Dyck, by Holbein or Dürer. They're right up there with the best of the best. Clearly, this is an artist whose output holds many surprises and some shocks as well. You'll understand how unassimilable and transgressive Cézanne's paintings would have appeared to the majority of his contemporaries from this juxtaposition. It's a juxtaposition that never occurred in actuality, but you can grasp the violence of the contrast between the smooth, sanitized idealization in Bouguereau's painting and the rough, almost brutal ungainliness of Cézanne's. Pierre Bourdieu, whom I mentioned earlier, described the academic nude as euphemistic. A euphemism names the unmentionable. Sex, the animal body, the object of desire. This euphemistic treatment keeps those dangerous, taboo qualities at a safe distance. It imposes a semblance of propriety. I quote Bourdieu, "Academic rhetoric is a rhetoric of euphemization. It euphemizes the nude, so as a consequence, abandoning academic rhetoric causes the shattering advent of the nude as a nude," unquote. The nude, thus revealed, is identified, according to the conventional thinking of the time, with realism. And realism, as it was then understood, returning to Bourdieu's words, takes the side of grossness. It means gross in every sense of the word, both in the manner of representation and in the object of representation. Taken as a whole, the flagrant inconsistencies, the inexplicable errors, the dogged persistency or the perverse doggedness of Cézanne's approach set him apart and made his works strikingly interesting to those few, those very few, who were curious and sympathetic to what they perceived as his dilemmas, his predicament, his situation as a rank outsider. For them, Cézanne's works were paradox incarnate. As Émile Bernard recounted of his early exposure to Cézanne's paintings, Nothing was so disconcerting as these canvases where the most sterling qualities were overwhelmed by the most childish naiveties. Young people felt the genius, old people the madness of paradox. Émile Bernard was the first, or one of the very first, to succumb to the influence of Cézanne's bather paintings and to discern admirable qualities in Cézanne's figure paintings. As we'll see presently, Cézanne's approaches to landscape and still life found admirers and began to exert an influence much earlier and more readily, of course. The subject of this lecture, Cézanne's posterity, is duty-bound to acknowledge the genius as well as the aberration, both being an outcome and an expression of a great crisis or of multiple crises. The young artists who began to gravitate towards him had begun to undergo themselves something of an analogous upheaval. Among the art historians who played an important role in Cézanne's posterity, their consciousness of him happens to be very much an amalgam of hearsay, of the accounts people have left of Cézanne's conversation, his appearance, his behavior. Among the anecdotes, there's one very hot potato, which I'm obligated to put forward as Exhibit A, because it is always put front and center of the contention that Cézanne was such a strange and aberrant painter because he was mentally unsound, because he was somewhat crazy. Exhibit A is from the memoirs of Cézanne's art dealer, Ambroise Vollard. On the screen, Cézanne's magnificent portrait of Vollard from 1899 and Pierre Bonnard's 1904 portrait of Vollard in the den of his art gallery, with one of Cézanne's bather's paintings hanging in the background. Here is what Vollard had to say. At the same time that he was painting my portrait, Cézanne was working on a large composition of nudes, begun in 1895, which preoccupied him almost to the end of his life. His dream was to pose his models in the open air. But that couldn't be done for many reasons, the most important of which was that women, even when they were dressed, intimidated him. For his compositions of the naked figure, he availed himself of life drawings he had done earlier at the Atelier Suisse in Paris, and for the rest, he drew upon his memories of museums. These remarks, first published in 1915, have passed as unassailable facts for 100 years and more, and have certainly created a good deal of havoc in commentaries and interpretations of Cézanne's life and work. They have served as evidence for the historian Maya Shapiro's hypothesis that Cézanne was a repressed homosexual. They supported Theodore Reff's contention that the series of paintings and drawings of a male bather with outstretched arms relates to the painter's anxiety about masturbation and or prohibition of masturbation. Then there's the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who in a famous essay called Cézanne's Doubt latches onto the phobias reported by Vollard to infer that Cézanne was schizophrenic. Then, of course, there are many arraignments of Cézanne for misogyny and also for misanthropy, given that his bathers, both male and female, are singularly unattractive, depersonalized, neutered, so to speak. The most arcane of all is T.J. Clarke's essay titled Freud's Cézanne. I've no wish to get involved with those speculations, but should point out there is a huge, invasive undergrowth that has attached itself to Cézanne's legend, and that Vollard's anecdotes, whether they be genuine or fabricated, corroborated or uncorroborated, have caused a good deal of mischief. And yes, they may have been of some advantage commercially to Vollard in marketing Cézanne as a character, one of a kind, an uncouth, untamed genius, a very novel and modern kind of artist hero. Of course, artists themselves would be scathing at the contention that not having recourse to live models, not making a figure look pretty, not putting sex appeal front and center of a picture is due to some pathological disconnect. I make a picture, not a woman, Matisse famously said. And you may recall an incident in lecture number 3, where an acquaintance of Cézanne's and Pissarro's had questioned the way a figure was painted in one of their works, and the reply coming from one or another of them was, "But Mr. So-and-so, we don't paint a figure, we paint accords. We paint accords." Soon we'll examine how Cézanne's visual language functions on the basis of accords or rapport. But before we move on, I need to tell you that nobody has ever come up with a shred of proof that the life drawings Cézanne did at the Atelier Suisse were prototypes for his bathers' figures, even though Vollard has been quoted again and again to this effect. Likewise, Cézanne's purported references to sculptures in museums, art historians don't seem to want to relinquish their search for the prototypes that Vollard hinted at, despite the fact that so many of the ones that they've latched onto are in fact quite unconvincing. Some of the bathers' compositions are indeed evocative of the arrangements of statuary that we see in museums, but evocation and derivation, alluding and copying, are not at all the same thing, of course. And contrary to what Vollard alleges, Cézanne did indeed paint portraits of women, real women, who were not his sisters, nor Madame Cézanne, in his studio, and he did have recourse to a live model, naked, female, as the works on the screen testify. Moreover, some of Cézanne's painter friends Achille Empereur in Aix, for example, regularly employed models, and Cézanne could easily have shared the cost and shared the advantage, had he so desired. From the images on the screen, we can deduce that he only consulted the model while he was painting the watercolor, and then at the end of the posing session continued adding to the watercolor in the absence of the model. He based the oil painting on the watercolor and on his visual memories. One can be fairly sure of this without the model returning. The problem of the position of her knees and her steadiness on her feet, he was evidently not able to rectify these in reference to the model or to any model. He certainly could have done so, but he opted not to. Art historians, like many people in the art public, give considerable attention to the referentiality of visual images. They're concerned with the model, the prototype, the source, the origin, the occasion, which links up with general assumptions about content and meaning. Because Pierre Bourdieu was a sociologist and wasn't trained as an art historian, his skeptical approach to art history can be extremely refreshing and welcome. In fact, the subject of his great book, The Symbolic Revolution effected by Manet, proves to be enormously relevant to Cézanne, who in his early years was very much caught up in the excitement and controversy caused by Manet's paintings. Bourdieu recognized that several of Manet's exegetes could get themselves in trouble by persisting, regardless, with their traditional art historical methodologies. For example, continuing to lean on the tradition of iconography when it is no longer really appropriate. Iconography originated in the Renaissance. It consisted of hunting down pre-existing models or prototypes in antiquity or in any prior works of art, which provide the keys for a symbolic reading of an image. Similarly, the tradition of hermeneutics, which pertain to the visual arts as well as to the literary arts. A hermeneutic approach assumes that the surface specifics of a work of art can be taken apart and transliterated into something else, that its rhetorical underpinnings can be laid bare and some essential meaning divulged. Iconography, hermeneutics seem to have been deliberately, strategically bamboozled as a feature of Manet's symbolic revolution. The elusiveness of sources, prototypes, and origins in Cézanne's work was and is taken to be a feature of his work's aggressive modernity. On the screen are sets and sequences of, there are many of these, of Bather's paintings, and they seem to refer to or relate to one another like variations without any pre-existing theme. in no discernible sequence, like a hall of mirrors. There are studies aplenty for the figures in these paintings in sketchbooks, which are the evident sources, origins, models. Like a puzzle or game, recommenced again and again, the adjustment and adaptation of the figures to each other and to their setting depends on the elasticity and mutability of everything, hence the plainness and neutrality of these humanoid stand-ins or substitutes in imaginary landscape settings. The function of color in breaking up individual forms and making them permeable to one another, that's a lingering influence of Impressionism, of course. But the phenomenally complex and subtle orchestration of color, which is not clear here due to the variable quality of these reproductions, unfortunately, this no longer relates to plein air painting. It's pure invention. His optic was much more closely related to his brain than to his eye. Emile Bernard wrote that in 1907. He is a pure painter, declared Paul Serusier. His style is a painter's style. His poetry, a painter's poetry, faced with the charm of coloured form, the utility, even the concept of the object, disappears. One thing should be remarked on: the absence of subject. In his early manner, the subject was commonplace, sometimes puerile. After his evolution, the subject disappears. There is only a motif. Well, yes, that's absolutely the gist of Cézanne's symbolic revolution as it impacted on the following generation of artists. And Emile Bernard, as we've seen, was one of Cézanne's earliest, most perceptive and articulate admirers. When he was only 23 years old, Emile Bernard published the first serious article anyone had written about Cézanne, a character profile in a series called Les Hommes d'Aujourd'hui, the Men of Today. And in it occurs this very memorable, this epoch-making formulation. He opened this surprising door to art, painting for itself. These terms, these ideas, have cropped up in previous lectures in the series: painting for itself, pure painting, the subject disappearing, the subject being only a pretext for painting, a painting being something that you look at, you don't look through it. But these contentions turn up in different places at different times, and it's important to grasp that the last quotations we've heard come out of the same milieu. And this milieu was a powerful generator of change in the history of modern art. In 1891, this fateful year, Emile Bernard was 23 and Paul Serusier was 27. And during the previous couple of years, they'd become close friends. both being intensely involved with Gauguin and the Pont-Aven group of painters. Cézanne, under Gauguin's instruction, had painted the Talisman in 1888, which he brought back to Paris, where it fired up his fellow students at the Académie Julian and inspired Maurice Denis to write his Nabi Manifesto, published in 1890, with its famous opening lines. Remember that before being a war horse, a naked woman, or some anecdote, a picture is essentially a plain surface covered with colors arranged in a certain order. As was discussed in Lecture 6, starting from around 1889, 1890, Gabriel Albert Aurier's forays into art criticism came pretty much out of the milieu he shared with Émile Bernard, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Maurice Denis. So their forthright claims made for the autonomy of painting, for the autonomy of art, would have come out of discussions and beliefs they held in common. When we examined the Talisman in the previous lecture, we noted the blocky, regimented brushstrokes, clear signs of some knowledge of, some interest in, the emulation of Cézanne, of course. In fact, Gauguin had begun collecting paintings by Cézanne while he was still a banker, before he became an artist. That's a still life he owned in the background of the portrait Gauguin painted in 1890. In fact, he owned 5 or 6 of Cézanne's works, which were among his prized possessions. And this particular still life, which had belonged to Gauguin, became the centerpiece of Maurice Denis' homage to Cézanne, which places Cézanne in the foreground, as if he's in the midst of explaining Cézanne's finer points, perhaps saying that Cézanne's paintings had no subjects in the usual sense of the word. There was only a motif, perhaps arguing that Cézanne, as distinct from the core Impressionists, provides the keynote of a new modernist art, post-impressionism, which is an art of synthesis. This word, synthesis, so much used by Gauguin, by Denis, by the Nabis, doesn't seem to have featured in Cézanne's vocabulary. At least it wasn't conspicuous, even though it perfectly categorizes his approach in all the media he engaged with. Whereas the essential skill required of an Impressionist painter is rapidly to analyze colors and tones in a natural scene and find equivalents on the palette, getting the dabs and dashes of those patches of color to merge and meld on the canvas. Cézanne's approach is much more of an intellectual performance, an intricate balancing act, a complicated arrangement of parts that tend to remain distinct rather than merging and melding. Cézanne's optic is more related to his brain than to his eye, as Emile Bernard astutely realized so very early. The towering giant behind the easel in Maurice Denis' Homage to Cézanne is the art dealer Ambroise Vollard, who gave Cézanne his first one-man show in Paris in 1895 and established the market for Cézanne's work. It was in Vollard's gallery that Picasso and Matisse, Braque and Derain, Bonnard and Vuillard, all the cashed-up collectors, the exhibition organizers and museum directors, the critics and historians who were to play major roles in Cézanne's posthumous fame. Ambroise Vollard's stock of paintings was for decades an epicenter for a thriving, massively expanding Cézanne cult. As in a fairy tale where the ugly duckling becomes a swan, the put-upon housemaid becomes Cinderella, a frog becomes a prince, so the maverick painter from Aix-en-Provence, who in 1894, no jury, not even in a dream, could see the possibility of accepting into any respectable exhibition, this same Cézanne was poised at the brink of the 20th century to be acclaimed not just as a father of modern art, but as the father of modern art. This was the first painting by Cézanne to be bought for a major museum collection. The director of the National Gallery in Berlin, Hugo von Tschudi, bought this painting from Vollard in 1897. Such works were not to Kaiser Wilhelm's liking at all, and when Tschudi was sacked from his job in Berlin, he transferred to the Neue Pinakothek in Munich and acquired this magnificent still life for the Munich collection. This is a painting that Cézanne has worked through to the nth degree, to an extraordinary degree of resolution and finality. A few features that in isolation might seem a little bit strange or a little bit wrong or a little bit inconsistent, we readily accept because they're so powerfully integrated in the composition. And anyway, because Cézanne is a byword for those kinds of quirks. But surely he would have realized that the left and right corners of the table had been wrenched out of alignment. Hadn't it occurred to him to correct this very obvious error? Surprise, surprise! There are two versions of this still life, and the Munich painting is the later and greater one. But the broken back table has been transferred from version 1 to version 2, virtually unchanged. The same ginger pot, the same lidded jar, the same small table, they recur in this still life in the Musée d'Orsay, where three corners of the table are out of whack, where this small table is impossibly overburdened with objects, and where any sort of coherent naturalistic perspective is warped, contradicted, violated in the most outlandish way. And yet there's a composition that resolves, that makes sense on the picture plane. The loss, the breakup of a three-dimensional illusion is a gain for the plane surface covered with colors arranged in a certain order. And wow, there are only 16 or so canvases that Cézanne signed and this most radically unconventional and rule-breaking still life is one of them. The disturbances, the quirks, the omissions in Cézanne's paintings were eagerly studied by the generation of artists who came on the scene after 1900. Cézanne had become the tribal deity and totem for this generation of artists, as Roger Fry famously put it. This sumptuous still life by Matisse was his first painting to be acquired by a museum collection. It's also in Munich, and it's full of Cézannian allusions. The foot of the wall is dislocated. The sides of the table don't align. The ellipse of the flower pot is distorted into an oval. And there's a strict economy of means, nothing superfluous. Matisse has made the least do the most. Our impression of sumptuous luxury is conveyed by quite Spartan means. It's a beautiful painting, but it's also an incredibly brainy, ruthless, rigorous synthesis. And those shocking Cézannian infractions of naturalism and realism, which seemed so disturbing and transgressive in their time, these become the new orthodoxies of modernist painting in the 20th century. Modern art really appears to be one very long homage to Cézanne. I want to conclude by taking a long, hard look at this self-portrait Cézanne painted in the early 1880s. You'll notice the eyes are different colors, not like David Bowie, but because he painted them that way. There's a horizontal scratch over the yellowy-brown eye that's always worried me, but you see this scratch in early photographs of the painting, so maybe Cézanne intended it. By rights, a picture constituted of such drab colors, olive brown, other browns, blacks, shaded flesh colors, should be very dull indeed, but this is anything but. Although the painting is quite small, Cézanne invests it with a sense of density and monumentality. Notice how he has maximized the tension of the curve of his bald dome by flexing it against the massive opposing curve of the shoulder. This has been brilliantly accomplished. It's brilliant drawing by any standards. Notice also how the ensuing visual tension is offset by and released through the looser curves of the shirt front. The rough-hewn blockiness of the image is echoed in miniature by the rugged square brush marks, which do several things simultaneously. They suggest modeled volume, faceted planes, transitions between light and shade, while they also generate patterns among themselves and break ranks wherever it's required to stir up a lively surface and keep the color fresh. Distortions in the wallpaper pattern alert us to Cézanne's quest for visual synthesis. The irregularities in the wallpaper are absolutely strategic. The pattern has been edited down to only what is strictly useful for the composition. The diamond motifs and their interconnecting struts have been enlarged, diminished, emphasized, softened and frayed, or eliminated entirely. The diamond motif has provided Cézanne with a subtle means of connecting the foreground and the background. This is where we see how his notion of accords and rapport becomes really inventive and creative. The pointed shadows of the ear and the eye socket become implicated with the wallpaper pattern. So do the bridge of the nose, the zigzag of the lapel, the lines of the moustache and beard, the individual diagonal brushstrokes in diamond-shaped clusters of brushstrokes. It's an open-ended play of analogies. The color structure is no less complex and dynamic. The tawny color of the left eye, a tawny touch in the moustache, the light brown touch defining the lower lip, and the lighter folds of the black coat, these all correspond to colors in the wallpaper. While conversely, the pillar of blue-gray on the left is just as intensely painted as anything else. It is nuanced, variegated, alive. It infiltrates tints of the skin, the beard, the shirt front, and picks out quatrefoils in the diamond motif of the wallpaper. And so Cézanne creates a balanced, harmonious, maximally integrated composition by inventing these intricate, ingenious systems of correspondence. The whole thing is to put in as much rapport as possible, he explained. There's a drawing in Cincinnati which I assume was done at the same time, and I assume that the differences between the drawing and the painting are didactic. The drawing doesn't have anything angular, no diamond shape in the ear or eye socket. It's all curves, and its lines allude again and again to the apple with which it's juxtaposed. I ventured to say earlier that Cézanne, more than any other artist, occupied a place on the fault line running through 19th century painting. His work dramatizes the disarray and disintegration of many fundamental conventions, the conventions of classicism, the conventions of realism and naturalism, some might even say the conventions of representation itself. The revocation of outline in drawing, the indeterminacy of edges and limits that we considered in Lecture 1, Cézanne takes this on more explicitly and seemingly more disastrously and destructively than anyone, but from it something new is born. Cézanne's drawing, like his painting, has more to do with his brain than with his eye, and his powerful synthetic intelligence enables him to make something out of the disintegrating language of naturalism. The shaky drawing on the right, a page from a sketchbook, is an independent graphic composition, and the more you look at it, the more you realize how it's really a little wonder. its balance on the page, the dynamic relationship of the marks, the syntax, an abstract syntax, a syntax on the surface of the page, qualifies this drawing as a fulfilled pictorial construction. The abstract syntax that this drawing lays bare, well, you can see from the etching in the middle by Picasso and the painting by Malevich, where some of its implications are going to lead others. Cézanne's posterity was kick-started by the 1895 exhibition at Vollard's Gallery, but the point of consecration from which all else followed came in 1904 with a whole gallery in the Salon d'Automne devoted to his paintings. In 1906, Cézanne's paintings were once again conspicuous in the Salon d'Automne, and in 1907, after his death, the monumental bathers paintings he worked on towards the end of his life became known and made a sensational impact. The largest painting he ever did, the Philadelphia Bathers, saw light of day in the Salon d'Automne in 1907. Within a year, André Derain had painted his response. And Picasso his, and Matisse, and from then on an unstoppable proliferation. Morandi in Italy, Colin McCann in New Zealand, John Passmore in Australia. Mondrian was one of the co-organizers of the exhibition that first brought Cézanne's paintings to Holland. Kandinsky considered Cézanne to be the root of modern art, that was his word, and hailed him as the seeker of new laws of form. It's even possible to regard Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles as a work that comes fairly and squarely out of a Cézannian idiom. But the crowning irony of Cézanne's fabulous and seemingly limitless posterity is something that we can truly savor. Cézanne's erstwhile best friend, Émile Zola, and Zola's cronies fell into the habit of referring to Cézanne not merely as a failure as an artist, but as impotent, impuissant. This was a taunt that came up again and again in Zola's terrible novel, L'Œuvre, whose central character channels all of Zola's disappointment, disapproval, and disavowal of his boyhood friend. Impotent, what an irony. Has an impotent person ever produced, on a global scale, such a wealth of progeny? Thank you for your interest. See you again.